I'd like to talk about the Spanish Empire, and especially to focus on the missions. And the theme of this discussion is that the missions enabled conquest. The Spanish Empire had a presence in the Americas since the 16th century. And the base of those operations was what became Mexico. Mexico had by far the largest population of any Spanish colony, over 6 million people. And the desire to press forward and expand that empire meant that over 200 years after the Spanish were in Mexico, they decided to set up outposts in the northern reaches of its North American empire, which was California, Alta California. Why? Why wait all that time to begin setting up missions and beginning trying to colonize and populate an area? If we think of some of the explorers who traveled past the coast before the Spanish set up shop in California, we think of Juan Cabrillo, who was Portuguese, exploring for Spain and was looking for a passage to India. He came by around 1542, but didn't stop. We know Francis Drake, the English explorer, sailed past this area around 1579. Another merchant adventurer, Sebastian Vizcaino, came by in 1602, but they never stopped to try to create a settlement. Part of the reason for that is that none of these explorers could find gold. And gold was at the heart of European conquest of North America. It was certainly at the heart of Spanish conquest of North America. So why now? Why begin to establish missions and then colonies in the 18th century? And the answer is simple: competition. Competition from Russian traders coming down the coast, competition with England, the arch enemy of the Spanish Empire, competition with France, and even competition with English settlers on what is the east coast of North America, gradually pushing across to the west. So how are you going to do it? How are you going to set up colonies to populate this area, which up until 1769 had almost no real European settlement? The answer is to create missions. The Jesuits were the first denomination to create the missions in Mexico and in much of the Spanish Empire. But it's not the Jesuits who set up the California missions. It's the Franciscans. The Franciscans, another Christian denomination, achieved greater power and influence with the Spanish king, King Carlos III, and the Jesuits got pushed to the side. So that's one difference in the colonization and conquest of Alta California compared to Mexico. But it's also this idea that at the very time when the Spanish Empire is in serious decline, its officials are trying to spread and develop the northern reaches of that empire. And how are you going to do it? As Kerry McWilliams tells us, it's the missions. And this is a form of what at the time was called a kind of spiritual conquest, in which you first set up the missions as the foundation for settlement. Through the missions, you create a town, as long as it thrives. And eventually, if you're successful enough, you create cities. But it's got to start with the missions. And that's exactly what the Spanish did. Beginning in 1769, and then moving up the California coast, 21 missions over a period of several decades. And those missions were meant to attract Indians to the settlement so they could be baptized, Christianized, turned into farmers, and forced to break away from their native culture. The missions did not quite turn out the way the Spanish government had originally envisioned them, but they certainly did have some successes. So let's talk about some of the successes as well as the failures. We know that Junipero Serra, a Franciscan monk, came to California and founded the first missions in San Diego, and then proceeded to found several other missions, although he was never in San Gabriel. San Gabriel was one of the first missions founded in this area, and then eventually San Fernando Mission, again not founded by Junipero Serra, but by his colleagues. And they would set up a mission with, say, 2 or 3 priests, 4 or 5 soldiers. You create a makeshift camp. You attract Indians to the mission, either through icons or through the promise of trade or protection. And through that, you gradually entice a larger group. After they are baptized, they form a permanent part, or are meant to form a permanent part of the mission, and then gradually become farmers, laborers, musicians. They create a thriving community. And that did happen around the San Gabriel Mission, and that did happen around the San Fernando Mission, the 2 missions of Los Angeles County. Although we have to be careful with that word thriving. If you look at the number of cattle on these missions, cattle which was not native to the area, you begin with, by 1785, or almost 20 years into this process, you have in the mission system over 25,000 head of cattle, where there were none before. I suppose that's a kind of success. By 1820, or roughly around the time when secularization is kicking in, you have almost 150,000 head of cattle. So cattle has become a very important part of the economy and the lifestyle of this area. That's a kind of success. Indians learned Spanish music. They learned to play flutes and guitars and violins and drums, which had largely been banned in many other areas because the fear of drums as a means of communication. And they sang. So we have reports of musical groups, bands performing and playing in these areas where there were none. That's a kind of success. Learning crafts that the priests taught them, sheep and cattle herding, and agriculture. But there are also a lot of problems, and Kerry McWilliams goes into these in quite some depth. Above all, the Indians had almost no resistance to white men's diseases, to smallpox, to these terrible influenza, devastating diseases that would wipe out whole communities. And then syphilis and gonorrhea, sexually transmitted diseases that made it extremely difficult for women to conceive. So where the Spanish envisioned thriving communities of Indians around a mission, in fact, what we find are tens of thousands of Indians dying off who were connected to the missions. And that remained one of the most frustrating aspects of the Spanish conquest of this area. The difficulty over time of attracting Indians to the missions, keep making them stay on the missions, and then hoping that they would be productive to create larger communities. There were armed conflicts between the Indians and the Spanish that McWilliams goes into. We know that the Franciscan Padres at times shackled or beat or punished the Indians for either running away or not obeying. And according to one letter, which was by no means unusual, this is from Narcisco Duran, who was father president of the missions in the 1820s. He said, "The Indian by nature is apathetic and indolent, so much so that the Spanish rule of 10 years is for him wholly inadequate." And so the relationship was really one of patriarchy, seeing the Indians as children, despite the fact that they had a highly developed culture and lifestyle in this environment for thousands of years. And soldiers were a constant problem. Indeed, for the priests, the soldiers, although they were there to protect them, were in a way the bane of the missions. For it was often the soldiers who were impregnating or raping the Indian women, passing on sexual diseases, and really bringing in a culture of violence that had scarcely existed there before. And if we talk about Christianizing, we have difficulties with that term, because how Christian did the Indians actually become? Yes, they were baptized. Tens of thousands of Indians were baptized. And so officially that makes them Christian. But they also have to follow the practices and the beliefs, the traditions and the rituals. And here we find relatively little enthusiasm on the part of many Indians to do that, because their traditions of the sweat houses and of the searching for sea life, the Michumash, the trade with the shell bead money, that whole culture was shunted to the side, indeed banned to a great extent. And so this was not an effort to integrate previous culture into this new culture, with perhaps the exception of the drums and some percussion instruments, but rather the placing on of European culture onto these tribes, grafting it on, if you will, and finding relatively little success for Indians truly to embrace this new Christian culture. As far as Los Angeles is concerned, however, the San Gabriel mission was absolutely central, because it's the San Gabriel mission where 44 settlers, pobladores, came up from Mexico across the Sonora Desert and arrived at the San Gabriel mission to try to rest up. It's a devastating journey by foot. And then, with the promise of land, made the trek to the Yankna village of what is now downtown Los Angeles, to set up farms around a courtyard that Felipe de Neve, whose sculpture stands in the center of downtown Los Angeles, had designed and set up. And so we find from the missions an effort to colonize an area, to try to fulfill the original idea of the Spanish Empire, to lay conquest to an area that had been, for over 200 years, scarcely touched by Spanish explorers.